50 years of legacy, stolen and twisted on a gleaming stage until the only thing left to do was expose the poison she built her fame upon. The scent of cardamom and slow-simmered lamb usually filled my small kitchen with a comforting blanket of warmth, a smell that had clung to my apron strings for 50 years. Now, it just smelled like failure. I leaned heavily on the worn butcher block, the wood permanently stained by decades of turmeric and patience, and watched the local news segment playing silently on the tiny kitchen TV. There she was, Isabella, my daughter-in-law, radiant in a crisp white chef's coat, standing before a gleaming stainless steel counter that looked like it belonged on a spaceship, not in a place serving food. The segment was a puff piece celebrating the grand opening of the Gilded Spoon, the farm-to-table bistro she and my son David had poured every penny into. She was being interviewed by some smarmy local anchor who kept using the word innovative. "Isabella, your approach to traditional Mediterranean flavors is revolutionary," the anchor cooed, gesturing toward a dish that looked like a deconstructed pile of foam and microgreens. Isabella smiled that perfect practice smile that didn't quite reach her eyes that, incidentally, looked startlingly like my late husband's. "Thank you, Mark. It's about respecting the ingredients while pushing boundaries. We've stripped away the clutter, the heavy, antiquated techniques, and focused on pure essence." My hand tightened around the rolling pin. Antiquated. That was the polite word she used in public. Behind closed doors, the words were usually sharper. When she first moved in with us, trying to get her feet wet in the culinary world, I'd tried to share my grandmother's sourdough starter instructions. She'd looked at the bubbling, milky goo in the crock like it was radioactive waste. "Grandma," she'd sighed, tapping away on her phone, "we use freeze-dried yeast cultures now. They're standardized, more predictable." But the irony, the brutal, delicious irony, was that David had begged me to give her the recipes. Not the sourdough, no. He meant the recipes. The ones that had kept my family afloat through recessions and hard times. The ones that made people drive 3 states just for my moussaka or my specific, intensely layered spanakopita. David, bless his naive heart, thought an infusion of his beautiful, ambitious wife's modern flair with my generational cooking would be a guaranteed hit. I had been reluctant, handing over the brittle, stained index cards that held the very soul of our kitchen. They were annotated in 3 different fading inks, covered in notes about humidity and the exact moment to stir in the last bit of rendered fat. "They're just old-fashioned, Isabella," I'd told her, handing over the box. "They need time, and they need a very hot oven." She'd taken the box, looking down her nose slightly. "I'll see what I can do, Nana. Maybe digitize them. Streamline the process." Streamline. She digitized them all right. I saw the pictures on their Instagram feed. My grandmother's rustic stuffed peppers, now presented as heirloom vegetable pods with smoked paprika dust. Then came the moment that had haunted me for the last 6 months. The Gilded Spoon was failing its initial soft launch. David looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 weeks. Their modern minimalist food was getting panned by critics as cold and lacking depth. Desperate, David had gone to Isabella, who, defeated, admitted she couldn't make the signature dish, the one everyone seemed to mention in the one decent review they'd received, work. That dish was my lamb cleftico, slow-baked in parchment, sealed with wine-soaked string until the meat dissolved with a whisper. David had come to me, shamefaced. "Mom, please, just show her how to make the cleftico exactly like you used to. Just once." I agreed, under one condition. She had to follow my instructions to the letter, no modern shortcuts, no essences. She sat at my island looking utterly miserable, flour dusting her designer jeans. Honestly, Nana, this is barbaric. Boiling the onions first? And why are you using this oil? It's not cold-pressed EVOO. Because this oil knows what it's doing, I'd snapped back. For 3 agonizing hours, she watched me. I didn't just instruct. I performed a ritual. I showed her how to rub the lamb with the specific blend of herbs only I knew, how to layer the parchment just so, sealing the juices not just with string, but with a specific type of beeswax I ordered secretly from a farmer upstate. When the massive earthenware pot went into the industrial oven, she rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might stick. 2 weeks later, the Gilded Spoon relaunched with a menu heavily featuring the new rustic slow-cooked lamb shoulder. It was a smash hit. Critics raved about the unexpected depth, the ancient secret flavor. Isabella became an overnight sensation, and she never once mentioned my name. Back in my kitchen, the news segment showed the anchor taking a bite of the Cleftico, his eyes widening in theatrical ecstasy. This is what's missing from modern cuisine, a dish that tastes like history. Isabella beamed. We call it the heritage roast, Mark. It's a tribute to slow, thoughtful cooking. The camera zoomed in tight on her face, and then the anchor leaned in conspiratorially. So, Isabella, the buzz is that you've tapped into some incredible family legacy for this dish. Is it true you inherited these recipes from a very special, older relative? Isabella took a sip of water, setting the glass down with a decisive clink. She looked directly into the lens, right at me, past the TV screen, and her voice dropped just a shade, losing that television polish. Mark, honestly? I found a box of my mother-in-law's old moldy recipe cards when we were cleaning out the attic. I looked at them for about 5 seconds, thought they were completely unusable, and filed them away. The truth is, David and I painstakingly developed the flavor profile for the heritage roast entirely on our own, through months of trial and error in our test kitchen. It's all us. The anchor nodded sagely, completely bought in. My world narrowed to the sound of my own frantic breathing. My hands were shaking so badly I had to put the rolling pin down before I dropped it. She hadn't just ignored the truth. She had actively incinerated it on national television, planting a flag on my legacy. I stood there, tasting the bitter bile of betrayal rising in my throat, when David walked in the back door, looking tired but pleased. He must have been tasting the success on the front end. "Mom, what are you watching?" he asked, noticing the news segment. I pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "Your wife, David. She's on television." David grinned, relaxing against the doorframe. "Yeah, she's crushing it. That heritage roast is gold. Listen, I need to ask you one more thing before I head back. Isabella needs the exact measurements for that spice blend you used for the chicken marinade, the one for the new appetizer. She's trying to replicate the earthy undertones, but she can't nail the balance." I looked from the triumphant, lying face of his wife on the screen to the expectant face of my son, who was clearly benefiting from the very lie she had just spun. My voice was a low rasp. "The spice blend, David?" "Yeah, the one Nana always used to make. You know, for the rustic spiced chicken. Where did she keep those notes?" I stared hard at David, then back at the television where Isabella was waving goodbye to the anchor, her success built on stolen foundations. I knew the recipe he was asking about. It wasn't for chicken. It was the secret cure I used on my cured meats, the one ingredient that made them last forever. I opened my mouth, not to tell him the measurements, but to confess something else entirely. "David," I whispered, my eyes wide with a terrifying, cold clarity, "that spice blend she wants? It's not just for flavoring the chicken, it's a preservative. And the main component isn't thyme or oregano, it's hemlock. And I haven't made any for 6 months, but she just used the last of the sealed tin I kept for emergencies last Tuesday night, thinking it was just fancy smoked paprika." David blinked, the easy smile freezing on his face. He followed my gaze from the TV screen, where Isabella was now charming the camera crew, back to my pale, accusatory face. The silence in the small kitchen was suddenly heavy, thick as uncooked dough. "Hemlock, Mom? That's a joke, right? You've been watching too many old crime shows again. That's poison." His voice cracked slightly as he tried to force lightness into the accusation, but the dread was creeping in behind his eyes. He knew my seriousness when it came to my ingredients. I wasn't prone to theatrics, especially not about my cooking secrets. I stepped away from the butcher block, the floorboards groaning under my sudden movement. I walked to the pantry, not the shiny, organized pantry Isabella had installed in their new restaurant, but my own dusty, deep, under-the-stairs storage space. I reached behind a stack of rarely used canning jars, my fingers finding the familiar cool metal of a small, unmarked tin. I brought it out and placed it heavily on the counter between us. "It is poison, David. When I used it in my cured sausages 50 years ago, it was to keep them from spoiling in the summer heat before refrigeration was reliable. A trace amount, properly dried and ground, acts as a powerful and historically effective antimicrobial agent. It binds flavor. It's why my meats never turned. Why they tasted unforgettable." I tapped the tin with a fingernail. "I sealed this last one up the year before your father died. It was my insurance policy, a final batch, just in case something went truly wrong." David pushed off the doorframe, suddenly alert, adrenaline overriding his exhaustion. "And you think Isabella used it? When?" "She asked for the recipe for the earthy undertones in the chicken marinade, the one she wanted to call ancient poultry dust on the menu. I told her the blend was complex. She came here last Tuesday, remember? When you were at that supplier meeting in the city. She said she was practicing a new staff meal before the dinner rush." David rubbed his temples hard. "She cooks staff meals for the whole crew, Mom. 15 people, maybe more on a busy night. If she used that tin in the marinade and then served it to her entire opening staff, yes, David, that's exactly what I think happened." He staggered backward, bumping into a shelf of dry beans. The air in the kitchen seemed to thin. No, she wouldn't. She was just trying to get the recipe right. She was stressed about the reviews. She thought you were being melodramatic about the ingredients. She probably just swapped it for a commercial spice mix because she didn't want to look reliant on you. She said she needed the exact balance, David. She came to me specifically for the secret ingredient because the modern equivalents were failing her. She was trying to replicate the success of the Cleftico, which she didn't understand, and the only other thing she ever asked about with such intensity was that spice blend. She's cooking with history she doesn't respect, David, and history sometimes is deadly. We stood there, 2 generations caught in a silent, terrifying calculus. David paralyzed by the potential fallout for his career, his marriage, and now, potentially, his entire staff. Me, cold and certain, the weight of decades of obscure culinary knowledge pressing down on me. "We have to call them," David finally choked out, fumbling for his phone. "We have to call the restaurant. Now. Tell them to stop serving everything that used that spice. Immediately." "Too late," I said, my voice flat. The TV screen was still showing the anchor wrapping up his glowing segment. "Look." The anchor was taking one final exaggerated bite of the heritage roast, the lamb cleftico, the recipe I had painstakingly demonstrated, the dish Isabella claimed she had developed solo. He chewed thoughtfully, then nodded towards Isabella, who offered a final, triumphant wave. "Isabella, before we let you go," the anchor said, a sudden genuine curiosity in his voice, "I have to ask about the cleftico. It's truly astounding. Is it true you've been using that ancient parchment and beeswax sealing technique? It imparts such a unique, smoky richness." Isabella looked momentarily flustered. She glanced quickly to her left, as if looking for David, then rallied, delivering her practiced, cruel dismissal. "Oh, that!" She laughed dismissively, waving her hand as if batting away a persistent fly. "Honestly, Mark, that was just Nana's old ritual. I did it once just to humor David. It's completely unnecessary. We actually achieve a far superior, cleaner flavor profile by using a vacuum seal and a touch of hickory smoke essence. The old method just traps too much funk." David's phone was halfway to his ear. He froze. His face went ashen, not from the fear of hemlock contamination, but from the realization of the depth of her deception, both toward the public and toward him. She lied about the cleftico, too," he whispered, his voice hollow. "She told the critics she developed the flavor and that the ancient method was just funk?" "She needed the story of the secret recipe to get the initial buzz, David," I explained, my voice dangerously quiet. "But she couldn't stand being associated with the work that actually made it good. She needed to erase me completely from the narrative of her success." David finally dialed the restaurant's main line, his hand shaking violently. He held the phone to his ear, waiting through 3 agonizing rings. Finally, a young host picked up, sounding rushed. "The Gilded Spoon! How can I help you?" "This is David Thorne. I need to speak to Isabella immediately. It's an emergency," David roared into the receiver. There was a pause on the line, then a low, panicked murmur. "Mr. Thorne, I can't get her right now. She's in the back, with the owner of the food critic organization that gave us our first major review. They're doing a private tasting in the private dining room. She told me not to interrupt her for anything." David slammed the phone back onto the counter, the plastic casing cracking. He looked at me, his eyes wide and frantic, reflecting the disaster unfolding on the TV. "She's meeting the critic who championed the cleftico," he breathed, "the one that praised the ancient technique. She's presenting him with her new, superior vacuum-sealed version right now, trying to lock in the rave reviews, lying to his face about the method that actually won him over." I looked down at the tin of cured meat preservative, hemlock, that my daughter-in-law had confidently sprinkled over the staff's lunch. Then I looked at the television, where Isabella was basking in manufactured glory, about to pull off the final definitive act of theft by convincing the most influential person in the city that my work was not only irrelevant, but objectionable. "David," I said, picking up the cracked phone receiver and holding it out to him, my voice impossibly calm, "you need to tell me the exact ingredient list for the appetizer she wanted the recipe for. Because if she's presenting that critic with a dish flavored with my secret cure, and she served the rest of her staff food laced with actual poison, then we have 2 different disasters unfolding at once," I finished, my gaze fixed on the shattered phone on the counter. David snatched it up, his knuckles white. "The appetizer," he choked out, his mind racing between the two imminent catastrophes. It was called the Forest Forage Tartlet. It had those wild mushrooms she sourced from that upstate farmer you warned her about, the ones that only grow near the abandoned quarry. My blood ran colder than any ice bath I'd ever prepared. The lattice cap mushrooms? David, those aren't foraged. They're poisonous if not prepared with a specific neutralizing agent, a rare alkaline ash I use in my pastry doughs to break down the toxins. David stared at me, his breath hitching. She didn't ask for the ash recipe. She asked for the spice blend for the chicken marinade. She said she was experimenting with pairing the spice profile. She's an idiot, David. She's trying to make everything taste like the Cleftico, but she doesn't understand the balance. She used the spice blend, the one with the hemlock trace, as a substitute for the neutralizing ash, thinking it would give the tartlets an earthy depth, just like the lamb. The revelation hit them both like a physical blow. The hemlock in the chicken marinade was a slow-burn contaminant, possibly causing long-term illness in the staff. But the lattice caps, neutralized by the wrong agent, meant instant severe poisoning for anyone who ate the tartlets, and the most important food critic in the city was currently eating one. On the TV, Isabella was leaning over the table in the private room, gesturing animatedly toward a small, artfully constructed tartlet. The critic, a stout man named Mr. Hawthorne, whose reviews were legend, picked up a miniature silver fork. "It has a lovely, almost metallic tang," Hawthorne commented, inhaling the aroma. Isabella beamed, mistaking his description for the desired earthiness. David was already halfway out the back door, tearing toward the car keys. "I have to stop them. I have to get to the restaurant." "You can't." I grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "It'll take you 10 minutes to get there, and they're eating now. If you barge in there yelling about poison and stolen recipes, you'll ruin your business entirely, and you won't stop anyone from eating." "Then what, Mom? We just sit here while Isabella poisons her mentor and her employees?" His voice was a desperate plea. I looked at the TV, then at the spice tin. The hemlock was the slow poison. The mushrooms were the fast one. And Isabella's greatest weapon, her public image, was built on the lie about the Cleftico. We needed to use the truth of her lie against her quickly and dramatically. We don't need to stop the poison, David. We need to stop her narrative. We need to make them all stop eating immediately, without raising a full panic that gets the police involved before we can control the story. I spun around and grabbed the most potent thing in my pantry, something I hadn't touched in decades, a massive jar of pickled peppers preserved in pure, concentrated brine of vinegar, salt, and capsaicin, extract so high it made the air shimmer. "We use the ultimate flavor disruptor," I said, unscrewing the lid. The fumes alone made David cough violently, the strongest, most immediate physical reaction we can induce that isn't life-threatening. "What is that?" David gasped, wiping his watering eyes. "This," I said, holding up the jar, "is what happens when you try to build a reputation on flavor you don't respect. Get your phone. You are going to call the private dining room. You are going to tell the host to interrupt Isabella's presentation right now. Tell him you have an urgent message from the kitchen that the final tasting plate for Mr. Hawthorne has been accidentally swapped with the emergency decontamination sample. And when the host delivers that message, you are going to instruct him to casually spill a tiny amount of this brine near Mr. Hawthorne's plate." "Spill it? Mom, that's insane. It'll ruin the whole table." "It will ruin the taste," I corrected him, my eyes blazing with the certainty of a wronged artist. The shock of that capsaicin will overload his palate. He won't be able to taste the delicate sweetness of the mushroom or the metallic tang of the hemlock. He'll drop the fork, he'll start sweating, and he'll call for water. He will stop eating the tartlet. David looked terrified, but seeing no other immediate option, he nodded grimly and started redialing the restaurant. As he spoke frantically into the phone, trying to relay my insane plan, I watched the television screen again. Isabella, momentarily distracted by the host's whisper and David's frantic phone call filtering through the background noise of the restaurant, glanced toward the kitchen door, a flicker of anxiety crossing her face. She must have known I was furious. Then, Mr. Hawthorne, mid-sentence about the tartlet's complexity, suddenly paused. He hadn't spilled anything yet, but his face contorted. He slapped a hand to his mouth, his eyes beginning to water even before the host had finished relaying David's panicked warning. "What is it, Mr. Hawthorne?" Isabella asked, her perfect composure starting to fray. Hawthorne didn't answer. He was leaning forward, gripping the edge of the table, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. He wasn't reacting to the tartlet he was about to eat or the poison in the chicken marinade the staff was already consuming. He was reacting to the TV. I looked closer at the screen, following Hawthorne's gaze, which was fixed not on Isabella but slightly behind her, toward the bustling kitchen doorway, where the kitchen staff were frantically trying to handle the chaos David had warned them about. And then I saw it. Standing just behind Isabella's triumphant, oblivious figure, framed perfectly in the background of the shot, was a line of 3 terrified young cooks, their faces chalk white, clutching their stomachs and staggering against the stainless steel, the direct, immediate result of the hemlock-laced chicken. Mr. Hawthorne didn't drop the tartlet. He lurched backward, his voice a raw croak that the microphone surprisingly picked up clearly. "Isabella," he managed, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger past her shoulder toward the 6 staff. "What in God's name is happening back there?" The private dining room went silent. On the screen, Isabella's practiced smile shattered like thin ice under a heavy boot. Her eyes darted backward, following Mr. Hawthorne's shaking finger to the horrifying tableau unfolding in the background of the camera shot. 3 of her sous chefs doubled over, their faces slick with sudden cold sweat, one of them clearly retching into a nearby trash receptacle. David, still on the phone, looked up from the counter, catching the image on the TV. He dropped the receiver entirely. The chicken. They're reacting already. The hemlock acts fast when concentrated in the marinade, not just slow like in the old diluted sausage. My mind snapped into overdrive. The hemlock was killing the flavor, but the mushroom tartlet was the immediate threat to the critic, the linchpin of their entire reputation. And now the staff poisoning was visible to the world. Hawthorne's reacting to the visual evidence, David, not the taste of the tartlet yet. He sees his future meals being served by the actively dying, I hissed, grabbing the capsaicin jar again. We have to move faster than the news cycle. On screen, Isabella recovered with terrifying speed. She smoothly turned her back to the kitchen staff and smiled winningly at Mr. Hawthorne, effectively masking the suffering cooks from the camera lens with her body. "Mr. Hawthorne, please, don't worry about the back-of-house chaos for a moment," she said, her voice smooth as silk despite the looming disaster. "That's just kitchen stress, culinary passion boiling over. But look at this tartlet. This is the real story. I developed this flavor profile entirely independently. It's complex, it's rich, and it tastes precisely like the depth you loved in the Cleftico. See? No funk, just pure, innovative flavor." She pushed the tartlet closer to him, clearly daring him to take another bite, implicitly challenging my narrative that she had stolen the Kleftico secret. David, galvanized by the sight of his business collapsing in real time, finally found his purpose. He grabbed the jar of chili brine from my hand. I'm not ruining this with a subtle spill. I'm going to make them stop eating everything. He didn't wait for my reply. He bolted out the back door, running toward the front of the restaurant, intent on causing a public, undeniable, non-lethal scene. I turned back to the TV. The camera operator, sensing the sudden, massive shift in drama, zoomed in tight on Isabella's face, a face that was now a mask of frantic defensiveness. "And I want to be perfectly clear," Isabella announced to the camera, leaning into the microphone. "I've heard whispers about my mother-in-law's so-called recipes. Frankly, they are tired, old-fashioned, and irrelevant. We are the future. The only secret here is hard work and modern technique. I have never relied on stale family secrets for my success." That was the final straw. She hadn't just taken the recipes, she had actively mocked the source of her own current fame, seconds before the public realized her staff was being poisoned by the byproduct of her arrogance. I needed irrefutable proof that she had stolen the Kleftico method, proof that couldn't be explained away as old funk. I had one place left to look. I ran back to the pantry, ripping aside the loose floorboard beneath the old flour sacks where I kept my most treasured non-culinary secret. I pulled out a small velvet-lined wooden box. Inside lay the original parchment that held the Kleftico recipe, the one I'd taught her from, but beneath that, taped to the bottom of the box, was the true proof of my effort, a single yellowed, folded letter. It was from my own grandmother, written just before she died, explaining the origins of the Kleftico technique, detailing the specific regional dialect where the parchment wrapping style originated, and warning specifically about substituting any of the binding agents. A detail Isabella had clearly ignored. It was the context, the cultural blueprint she needed to understand the why, not just the how. I grabbed the letter, intending to run to David, but as I turned back toward the kitchen doorway, the TV screen flickered violently. The high-definition broadcast stuttered, the picture breaking into static and bright, distorted colors. The anchor's voice, usually so composed, crackled with static interference. "We seem to be having technical difficulties. A sudden power surge, perhaps? Mr. Thorne, are you seeing this in the back?" The camera operator, momentarily blinded by the power flicker, bumped the camera hard against a metal fixture. The lens swung wildly away from Isabella's face and focused for a horrifying second directly onto the floor just behind the main tasting table. And there, starkly visible in the harsh industrial light, were the crumpled remains of the original brittle index card for the Kleftico. It hadn't been digitized or filed away neatly. It had been torn into 4 pieces and carelessly swept under the edge of the rug by a clumsy busboy, right where the initial batch of Kleftico had been served. Isabella hadn't relied on her own genius, nor had she meticulously digitized my work. She had simply thrown the original documentation away after she learned the steps, demonstrating her utter contempt for the source. Just as the technician managed to regain control and swing the camera back toward Isabella, who was now desperately trying to reassure Mr. Hawthorne, the lights in the entire building, restaurant and my entire house, went out with a definitive thunk. I was left standing in the sudden, absolute darkness of my kitchen, the letter clutched in one hand, the glass jar of hyper-concentrated chili brine in the other, listening to the distant, muffled, frantic sounds of chaos erupting from the restaurant, knowing that David was likely either confronting the sick staff or trying to save the critic from an accidental chili bath, and realizing that Isabella's lie had just been exposed, not by my confession, but by the very evidence she tried to discard. And as the darkness enveloped everything, I heard a new, terrible sound, the heavy, distinct sound of the kitchen's back door violently slamming open and shut, followed by rapid, retreating footsteps on the gravel driveway outside. Isabella wasn't trying to explain herself anymore. She was running. The absolute darkness was suffocating, punctuated only by the distant wail of a siren. David must have called 911 for the staff. In the living room, the TV screen was dead, a glossy black mirror reflecting my own grim silhouette. I didn't hesitate. I knew Isabella's instinct for self-preservation was as sharp as any chef's knife. If she was running to secure the one thing she still believed guaranteed her future, the new menu concepts she'd been developing based on my other, less-known recipes. I fumbled for the spare key to David and Isabella's house, which I kept hidden beneath a loose stone in the garden, a habit from when David was a teenager and frequently locked himself out. I found the key, my hand steady despite the adrenaline thrumming through me. "David!" I called out into the darkness. His voice answered faintly from the front yard, strained and preoccupied. "Mom, the paramedics are here. They're checking the staff. Hawthorne's fine, thank God. He just choked on water when the lights went out. But Isabella's gone." The front door was ajar. I think she panicked and fled. "She didn't just flee, David. She's going for the notes, her contingency plan. She's heading for the office safe." David stumbled back inside, shaking his head, his face illuminated briefly by the blue flashing light from the street filtering through the window. "The safe? She wouldn't. That's where you keep the real generational recipes, the ones for the preserves and the artisanal breads she never bothered to learn." "Exactly. She needs a new foundation to build on, now that the Cleftico lie is public. She's going to take my remaining intellectual property and try to launch a clean slate concept by morning." I didn't wait for him to argue the logistics of getting to their house. I knew the back routes. I knew the service entrance schedule. I grabbed my old, heavy-duty emergency flashlight from the cupboard, the kind with the massive beam, and marched out into the cool night air. When I arrived at the Gilded Spoon 20 minutes later, the scene was utter chaos. Police tape crisscrossing the entrance, paramedics treating the groggy but thankfully non-fatally poisoned kitchen staff, and David standing outside, looking utterly defeated, talking to an investigating officer. I ignored the police. I bypassed David. I headed straight for the kitchen's service entrance, flashing my large beam through the window. The interior was already being processed as a potential crime scene, but the chaos bought me the cover I needed. I slipped inside the unlocked delivery door, moving with the practiced silence of someone who has spent a lifetime tiptoeing around sleeping family members. The office was down a narrow hallway past the walk-in freezer. The air here was cold, smelling faintly of expensive wine and desperation. I found the small disguised wall safe behind a framed, poorly rendered watercolor of a pheasant, a gift from Isabella. I knelt down. I didn't need a combination. I knew the safe wasn't top of the line. David, in his youthful confidence, had installed it himself. I pulled a thin, hardened steel letter opener, a souvenir from my husband's retirement party, from my coat pocket. I worked the tip into the slight gap between the door and the frame, right above the dial. It took 5 tense minutes, the only sound the rhythmic click hiss of the freezer units nearby. Then, with a soft thunk, the lock mechanism disengaged. Inside, stacked neatly, were the binders containing the modern menu drafts, the supplier contracts, and exactly where I expected them, 2 heavy leather-bound journals. These were my grandmother's handwritten accounts of the preservation techniques, the true wealth of our culinary history. As I reached for them, a shadow fell across the open, safe door. "Looking for something, Nana?" Isabella stood there, panting, her pristine white chef's coat now smeared with grease and dirt, her triumphant mask completely gone, replaced by raw, venomous fury. She must have doubled back, realizing she couldn't just disappear without her contingency plans. She held a heavy, ornate silver serving platter, one of the expensive ones from the restaurant's display case. It was glinting dangerously in the beam of my flashlight. "They're not yours to take," she spat. "This restaurant is ours. I made it famous. You can't steal my future just because your legacy is moldy." "It's not yours to keep, Isabella," I countered, slowly withdrawing my hands, not reaching for the journals, but resting them on the edges of the safe opening. "You stole the flavor, but you never understood the foundation. You never understood the cost." She took a step forward, raising the platter. "I understand solvency, old woman. And I understand that the police are about to find out that half my staff is hospitalized because of your damned secret spice cure. The police are going to find out that you served a potentially lethal mushroom tartlet to the most influential food critic in the state while simultaneously poisoning your employees with a banned compound because you were too arrogant to follow simple instructions," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "And I have the letter proving exactly what I taught you and what you chose to ignore." She faltered, the platter lowering slightly. She knew that letter was damning evidence of her prior knowledge. "You think a letter stops me?" she sneered, her eyes darting toward the office door. "I can say you planted it. I can say you're vindictive. They already saw your sick staff. They'll believe the ambitious young chef over the jealous mother-in-law." "Maybe," I conceded, taking another small step back, moving my weight onto the balls of my feet. "But David knows the truth, and the police have eyes on the kitchen right now. They're processing evidence of actual poison." Just as she decided her next move, whether to strike or run, the office door finally swung open behind her. It wasn't David. It was Mr. Hawthorne, pale and furious, flanked by 2 uniformed officers, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, illuminating Isabella perfectly framed in the doorway, holding the silver platter like a weapon. "I believe you have something that belongs to my assistant's mother, mister," Hawthorne announced, his voice regaining its authority, amplified by the shock of nearly being poisoned. "And judging by the scene out there, Detective, I think this young woman has a great deal more to explain than just culinary technique.